I was sitting at the dining table, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, when Kathy walked in and took a seat across from me. There was something different about her today, an unusual expression on her face that I couldn't quite place. I could tell something important was coming, but at that moment, I had no idea what it would be. Her eyes met mine, but there was no warmth in them, no comfort. It was almost as if she was bracing herself for something that she already knew would be difficult. Taking a deep breath, she broke the silence, her words coming out blunt and direct. "I've been having an affair with my boss, Alex." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but she didn't hesitate. There was no faltering in her voice, no sign of regret. It was almost as though she was delivering a grocery list, expecting me to accept this information with the same indifference. No stammering, no looking away. Just the cold truth laid out between us. I stared at her, feeling the shock settle into my bones. The numbness didn't last long, though. A wave of disbelief and confusion surged through me. This was the woman I had married, the person I had trusted, and yet here she was, casually confessing to something I could never have imagined in my worst nightmares. "I'll make sure that you get your share of physical intimacy," she continued, as though offering me some sort of consolation. Her words stung, not from their meaning, but from how little regard she had for the gravity of the situation. It felt like a cheap excuse, a hollow attempt to make everything okay again. "I'll make sure you're not left out, Ben, but you need to understand." The words were cutting, but what hurt more was the lack of any real emotion behind them. She wasn't apologetic. She wasn't even ashamed. Instead, she just seemed to expect me to accept this arrangement. My marriage, my life, my everything, reduced to a transaction, as if I should be grateful for whatever scraps she decided to throw my way. I was no longer listening to the rest of what she had to say. My chest tightened as I tried to process everything she had just thrown at me. The absurdity of it all nearly made me laugh, but I couldn't. I was angry, furious even. But more than that, I was hurt. Deep down, I could feel the weight of this betrayal crushing me, every second worse than the last. After a moment of silence, I couldn't hold it in anymore. A dry, bitter laugh escaped my lips, and I shook my head in disbelief. "Kathy, if you think I'm going to sit here and just go along with this, you've got another thing coming. You don't get to just throw your decisions at me like they're nothing. I'm not your doormat, and I'm not going to tolerate this." Her eyes widened in surprise, as if she hadn't expected this response. Maybe she thought I would cave, that I would be so dependent on her, or so afraid of losing everything that I would let it slide. But she was wrong. Her expression shifted as she saw the seriousness in my face. I was done. I pushed my chair back, ready to walk away, but Kathy wasn't done. Her face darkened, her features hardening with something I had never seen before. There was a sudden sharpness in her eyes, a cold, calculating edge that sent a shiver down my spine. "Ben, sit down," she said, her voice low, steady, almost menacing. "You don't get to just walk out of this conversation." I stopped in my tracks, my feet frozen in place. She was still watching me, her gaze unwavering. Slowly, she leaned forward, and a cold smile crept across her face. "You think you can just leave and find a lawyer and be done with me? No, Ben. That's not how this is going to work." I stared at her, disbelief mingling with fury. "Really? You think your threats will work?" "Oh, they will," she said, leaning even closer. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but the menace was unmistakable. "If you try to walk away from me, I'll ruin you. Do you understand? I'll go to the police. I'll tell them you hit me, that you threatened me. They'll believe me, Ben. Who do you think they'll trust? A well-respected attorney, or some accountant nobody's ever heard of?" I could feel my blood run cold as her words hung in the air. She wasn't just trying to scare me. She was laying out a plan, a threat that was real. She tilted her head, watching me closely, her gaze full of confidence. "You think you'll just pick up and move on, don't you? Well, I'll make sure you have nothing left. I'll make sure you're begging to come back." The words echoed in my mind as I stood there, the weight of them sinking in. This wasn't the woman I married. The person in front of me was someone I didn't recognize. She was cold, calculating, and she was willing to destroy everything I had worked for to get what she wanted. She looked at me as if she already knew the outcome, like she was certain I'd give in to her threats. And maybe, for a brief moment, she was right to think that. Maybe I would have caved, but not now. "So here's how this is going to go," she continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You stay, you'll play along, and you'll keep your mouth shut, or I will take everything from you and burn it to the ground. Your choice, Ben." Her words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of her threats pressing down on me. But there was something inside me, something that refused to bend, to back down. I stayed silent, my mind swirling as I waited for Kathy to finish. Her words were chillingly casual, as though she were dictating some everyday errand. "I expect you to make him comfortable," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Offer him a drink, maybe even a snack. Who knows? Maybe you'll even be nice to him." Her tone was almost mocking, and I could feel my anger rising in my chest like a hot, suffocating wave. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails biting into my palms, but I forced myself to keep quiet. I was doing everything in my power to stay calm, but it was becoming harder with every word she said. She looked at me with that cold, calculating stare, daring me to push back, to challenge her in any way. It was as if she was daring me to do something, anything, that would give her more power over me. The woman who had once loved me, who had promised to stand by my side, was now sitting across from me, completely unrecognizable. I could feel the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. "Do you think it's a good idea, Kathy?" I finally spoke, my voice calm, but the undertone of challenge was unmistakable. "What makes you think you can just pull this off like it's nothing?" Her eyes hardened, and she leaned in, her smile fading into something sharper, more dangerous. There was a hardness in her gaze now, a determination that sent a cold chill running down my spine. "Because I can, Ben," she said, her voice now low and unyielding. "Because this is my life, and I'll do what I want. And if you want to keep even a shred of your dignity, you'll do exactly what I say. You'll keep quiet, play along, and you'll pretend everything's fine." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. How could she say something like that with such finality, as if she held all the cards in this situation? How could she be so certain that I would just roll over and let her destroy everything? "I'll see you and Alex here tomorrow," she continued, her voice filled with smug satisfaction. "You'd better make a good impression." I blinked, barely processing her words. The sheer audacity of it was almost too much to handle. "Kathy, have you heard of Newton's laws of physics?" I asked, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. "For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. But with me, the action might be something you won't like. Trust me on that." Her eyes flickered with something like doubt, but she quickly masked it with another wave of condescension. "Rest assured, Ben. This is your call," she said, leaning back in her chair. "But I think we both know how this is going to end. Talk to your lawyer. Don't make it messy. This marriage is over. Walk away while I still allow you to walk." Her words hung in the air like poison, each syllable biting deeper than the last. The finality in her voice was deafening, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. But then I found my voice again. "Your threats will never work on me," I said, the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I have an alpha male in my life now. You are nothing." With that, she got up, her expression turning cold as she left the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I watched her walk out, feeling the weight of the situation crash down on me. It was clear now, this wasn't a marriage anymore. This was a battlefield, and I needed to fight back. "I'll be sleeping with her in your bed." The words landed like a slap to my face, but I held my ground, meeting his gaze without showing even a hint of intimidation. "Really, Alex?" I said, my voice laced with disbelief. "You think you can just waltz in here, throw around a few threats, and walk away with my life?" Alex barely blinked, a smug grin tugging at his lips. "Trust me," he replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We'll take the house, the car, your job, your income, everything, and we'll make sure you regret ever standing up to her." I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, my lips curling into a smirk. "The house?" I asked, barely able to contain my laughter. "That house isn't even mine, Alex. It belonged to my mother. I just live here. You won't get a penny from it." For a split second, Alex's confidence faltered. I could see the moment of hesitation in his eyes, but he quickly recovered, shifting gears to his next attack. "Fine, but we'll still take your job's income. Kathy deserves it, and I'll make sure you're paying her for the rest of your life." I took a slow sip from my glass, savoring the sensation of my control returning. "Sorry to disappoint you, Alex," I said with a calm, satisfied smile, "but I already resigned from my job." Alex's smug expression shattered. His eyes darted to Kathy, as if seeking some kind of confirmation or explanation. The shock was written all over his face. "What?" he asked, his voice faltering, clearly blindsided. What do you mean? You resigned?" "That's right," I said, leaning back in my chair, feeling a surge of satisfaction swell inside me. "So no assets, no job, no income for you to leech off. I guess that little plan of yours isn't as airtight as you thought?" Kathy's face twisted into a scowl, her fury evident as she stared at me, caught completely off guard by my move. Alex stood there, processing the situation, his mind frantically calculating how to recover. I could see it now, his grand scheme unraveling before his eyes, and for the first time in this whole mess, I felt in control of my own life again. "So, Alex," I said, my voice calm but pointed, "why don't you rethink exactly what it is you think you're taking from me? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's got nothing." Alex's face twisted into a sneer, a smug grin returning as he leaned in closer. "You're not in charge here, Ben," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm the alpha now, and you'll do what I say. In fact, I think I'll take Kathy upstairs to your bed right now. There's nothing you can do about it." The fury I had kept contained for so long flared within me, my blood boiling at his words. Slowly, I set my glass down, my hands steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Alex," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "I'm warning you. Get out of my house right now." But instead of backing down, Alex laughed. It was harsh, mocking, and it stung more than it should have. Before I could react, his hand came down hard across my face, the slap sharp and stinging. It wasn't the physical pain that struck me, though. It was the fury, pure, unbridled rage, that coursed through my veins. Alex stood there, looking down at me with a cocky smirk, clearly enjoying the moment. "You really think you can stand up to me?" he sneered. "Guys like you are all air and no substance. I'm the real deal, Ben, and I can destroy you. You're nothing. Men like me are in control, and I'll make sure you rot in jail if you try anything. You'll be begging for mercy by the time I'm done with you." The slap stung, but that was the last straw. It snapped something inside of me. All the humiliation, the months of disrespect. It boiled over in that instant, breaking the dam of restraint I had tried so hard to maintain. I stood up from my chair, my fists clenched, my voice low and steady. "You think you're the real deal, Alex?" I said, my words cutting through the air. Ben's fist connected with Alex's jaw with a satisfying crack, sending him stumbling back. Before Alex could react, another punch came, then another. Each hit was a release, an exorcism of the anger that had been festering inside me for far too long. "You think the real deal, Alex?" I spat with every punch. Real men don't try to tear apart other people's lives. Real men don't walk into another man's home and act like they own it. And real men don't ruin marriages for their own ego. Another punch landed, this one squarely on Alex's ribs, and I heard a satisfying crack as he gasped for breath. "Real men protect their families," I said, my voice growing more intense with each strike. Alex tried to defend himself, but I didn't stop. Not yet. Each hit was a declaration. Each punch was an affirmation of my resolve. Finally, I picked Alex up by his shoulders, lifting him to his feet. I looked him dead in the eyes. "I'm not an alpha," I said, my voice steady but firm, "and I'm not a beta. I'm a man who's done with the bullshit." Ben stood over Alex, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. He had just hoisted the man up with ease and slammed him down onto the floor, watching as Alex crumpled. The sound of impact reverberated in the room, and Ben's anger simmered beneath the surface, yet he felt a strange satisfaction. "Alex," The man who thought he could waltz into Ben's life and tear it apart now lay bloodied and beaten on the floor. Ben took a step back, breathing hard, trying to steady himself. The fight had ended in a way that felt both inevitable and necessary. Kathy stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief as she watched Alex crumble to the ground. She couldn't process what had just happened. Her hands trembled as her emotions conflicted. Rage and fear coiled inside her. Without thinking, she rushed at Ben, her fists flying in a desperate attempt to make him stop. But before she could land another punch, a strong grip seized her wrists. The force yanked her backward, pulling her off balance. She spun around to face her attacker, her heart racing. The woman holding her was built like a wall. Short cropped hair, intense eyes, and an unrelenting grip around Kathy's wrists. Kathy struggled, but it was no use. The woman's movements were swift and controlled, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. "Let me go," Kathy screamed, jerking her arms in an attempt to break free. "No," the woman said, her voice low and commanding, "You're done." With terrifying ease, Linda twisted Kathy's arms behind her back and forced her to her knees. Kathy gasped, unable to fight back, and Linda used her body weight to slam Kathy to the floor beside Alex. The former Marine was in her element, her face set with grim satisfaction. Kathy lay on the floor, gasping for air. But Linda wasn't finished. She stepped back, assessing Kathy with cold precision before launching into a series of brutal punches. Each blow landed with unyielding force, fists slamming into Kathy's chest and stomach. Linda moved like a storm, relentless and unstoppable, striking with a speed and power that only someone with her training could muster. Kathy tried to shield herself, but it was futile. Linda's strikes came too fast, too hard, and Kathy could barely gasp for breath between the hits. Ben stood in the background, catching his breath, watching the scene unfold in front of him. It was all happening so fast, yet in a way, he felt strangely detached. He couldn't bring himself to raise a hand against a woman, but he knew that Linda had handled the situation swiftly and decisively. She was exactly what Kathy needed. Someone who wasn't afraid to step in and show her the consequences of crossing the wrong people. Linda took a step back, wiping her hands as if she had just neutralized a threat. "I don't think she's going to be causing you any more problems," Linda said with a grim satisfaction, glancing down at Kathy. "She's learned the hard way what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Ben nodded, appreciating Linda's help and her staying hidden during the confrontation. He'd never wanted to resort to violence himself, but he couldn't deny the way the situation had played out. The police and medics arrived shortly after, their sirens wailing in the distance. They rushed into the house, taking control of the scene with practiced ease. Ben stood off to the side, trying to steady himself as they attended to Alex and Kathy. Alex was barely conscious, his face swollen and bloodied. Kathy, on the other hand, was sitting up, her eyes wide with a mix of rage and fear. Both of them were swiftly loaded into ambulances and carted off to the hospital. The real fallout was just beginning. Later that evening, the officers continued their questioning at the hospital. Alex, still groggy from the beating, tried to assert himself despite the pain. He sat upright on the hospital bed, his voice shaky but filled with defiance. "I want to file a complaint against Ben," Alex demanded, attempting to regain some bravado. "He attacked me in cold blood, and I want charges pressed." The officer, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped his notebook closed slowly, never taking his eyes off Alex. His voice was low, his tone colder than before. "You sure about that?" he asked, his gaze unyielding. "You realize who you're talking about, right?" Alex looked confused, unsure of where this was going. "What are you talking about?" The officer leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. "Ben's a former biker. He's associated with one of the most notorious gangs in the state. The kind of people you don't want to mess with. If you file that complaint, you won't just be dealing with him. You'll be dealing with all of them." Alex's bravado cracked. His eyes widened, and his throat tightened as the full realization of what he had gotten himself into began to sink in. The officer wasn't done. "This beating," he continued, his words hard as steel, would be a cakewalk compared to what might come your way if you make this a police matter. Are you man enough to take on all of them? Alex's body shook with fear as the officer's words settled in. He could feel the weight of the threat pressing down on him, his mind racing. The idea of facing not just Ben, but an entire gang of bikers, the kind of people who had no problem taking things much further than a few punches, terrified him. His eyes darted around the hospital room, searching for any sort of escape, but there was none. He had no choice but to face the reality of what he had gotten himself into. The image of Ben's fists pounding into him, of being completely helpless under the weight of that anger, flooded Alex's thoughts. It wasn't just the physical pain that rattled him. It was the fear of what could come next. Alex's bravado had crumbled in the face of true danger. The officer had made it clear. This was no idle threat. Ben wasn't just some regular guy he could confront and get away with it. Ben was connected to something much larger, something that would not be easily shaken off. His face drained of color, and his voice trembled as he finally spoke. "No, I won't file anything. Forget I said anything." The bravado that had once filled him had evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The officer nodded, closing his notebook with a snap, standing up. "Good choice," the officer said, his tone flat and serious. "I'd advise you to keep your distance from Ben and anyone connected to him. You wouldn't want to regret this further." Alex said nothing, the fear still thick in his throat. He had no idea how deep this hole went, but one thing was clear. This was far from over, and he wasn't prepared for the consequences. He had thought he could get away with this, but now he realized the cost of underestimating Ben and the danger that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Kathy was standing outside Alex's room, her mind racing with anger and frustration. Her face was bruised but still intact, the remnants of the beating she had taken earlier still visible. The humiliation was burning deep inside her. She had been assaulted and beaten, but she wasn't going to let Ben get away with this. Her plan was clear: divorce him, destroy him, and leave him with nothing. That was the goal, nothing less. She walked into Alex's room with a sense of determination, her steps purposeful. Alex was sitting on the bed, looking a mess. His face was swollen, cuts and bruises marking his features, and he was clearly shaken from the beating. When he saw her, his eyes widened with fear, and he looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. "Leave me alone, Kathy," Alex said, his voice hoarse and tired. "I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I value my life." His voice cracked as he spoke, and it wasn't the bravado Kathy expected. Alex wasn't talking about continuing their plan anymore. He was scared of what had just happened and terrified of what might come next. "You've really gotten us into something we should have never been part of," he muttered, his eyes filled with terror. Kathy blinked, taken aback by his sudden change in tone. She was used to controlling the situation, but this wasn't what she expected. She stepped closer to him, her tone desperate. "What are you talking about? We can still make this work. I'll divorce him. We'll take everything. Just hang on." But Alex cut her off, his eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "If you value your life, you need to drop everything. Leave Ben and get out of town now." Kathy was confused, stunned by the shift in Alex's demeanor. "What do you mean? Leave him? We're almost there. This is just the beginning. We've got everything lined up." Alex swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on the bed. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice trembling with real fear. "Ben isn't just some guy you can divorce and walk away from. He's connected. He was part of a biker gang, a really dangerous one. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. People like him don't just let things go. If you go after him, if you try to take anything from him, he'll come after you. And trust me, it won't be just a slap across the face. It'll be worse." Kathy's heart started to race. She had always known Ben had a rough past, but she had never imagined it could be like this. She had always thought of him as weak, someone she could manipulate. But now, hearing Alex's panic and fear, it was clear she had grossly underestimated him and his past. The man who once seemed like the perfect victim was someone far darker, someone whose connections ran deeper than she had ever anticipated. Ben's not just some regular guy, Alex continued, his voice filled with desperation. I was stupid to think we could take him on. If you file for divorce and try to take anything from him, you'll be marked. You're dealing with a whole other level of danger. And it's not just Ben you'll piss off. You'll anger the whole gang. They'll find you, Kathy. They'll make your life hell. Kathy's thoughts were spinning. The fear in Alex's eyes was real, and it made her blood run cold. She had never understood the full scope of the situation, never fully appreciated how deep Ben's involvement went. Alex's words hit her like a slap in the face, and suddenly, the plan she had so carefully put in place didn't seem like a sure thing anymore. Ben wasn't just the man she had married. He was someone with a dangerous past, someone she couldn't control. You need to leave. You need to leave now, Alex repeated, his voice frantic. No divorce, no nothing. Just get out of here. Kathy stood frozen, the weight of Alex's words pressing down on her. She had thought she could handle this. She had thought she could destroy Ben, take everything he had, and walk away unscathed. But now, faced with the reality of Ben's connections, her confidence was shaken. She wasn't sure what to do, but one thing was clear. She had underestimated the man she had once called her husband. Kathy stood frozen in place, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Everything she had planned, the revenge, the dreams of taking everything from Ben, seemed so distant now, overshadowed by a gnawing fear she could no longer ignore. Alex's words had shattered the foundation of her resolve. Everything he had said rang too true. She had always thought she could control this, that she could handle whatever came next. But now, the reality was sinking in. She wasn't in control anymore. In fact, it was becoming clear that if she didn't listen to Alex, if she didn't just walk away from this mess, Ben's world would consume her whole. Kathy, Alex whispered, his voice barely audible, you do nothing. You walk away quietly. If you try to drag this out, if you try to take him down, you're not just fighting him. You're fighting everything he's connected to. And trust me, you'll lose. You need to leave him, leave now, before it's too late. Kathy's hands trembled as she absorbed his words. She felt trapped in a nightmare, one of her own making. The anger and frustration from earlier had been replaced with a cold, terrifying truth. There was no way out. The power she once thought she had was slipping through her fingers, and she knew now that any further confrontation would cost her everything. As the days passed, the town seemed to change. The once peaceful streets were now filled with the rumble of powerful engines. 70 bikers, each on their massive machines, made their presence known, patrolling the area with a force that was both intimidating and relentless. The roar of their engines vibrated through every corner of town, an unspoken reminder of the world that Ben had come from, a world that had more power than anyone in town had ever imagined. Kathy, her resolve broken, made her decision. The fear was overwhelming, and she knew she had to escape before it was too late. She met with Alex's lawyer, signed the divorce papers, and walked away from the marriage with nothing. No assets, no custody. The settlement was a bitter reminder of how much control she had lost over her own life. Despite Alex's assurances that it was for the best, Kathy knew that she wasn't just leaving Ben. She was leaving town to save whatever was left of her life. 5 days after signing the divorce papers, Kathy was gone. She packed her things quickly, taking only what she could carry, and left without a word to anyone. She disappeared as swiftly as she had come, her name fading into nothing more than a whisper on the wind. But Alex was not so lucky. His bravado had been shattered, and the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. For the 7 days that Alex spent recovering in the hospital, he wasn't alone. Every day, without fail, 2 bikers arrived during visiting hours. They didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. Their mere presence was enough. They sat in silence, their eyes fixed on him, unwavering and cold. Each time Alex woke up, groggy from the pain, those 2 men were there, watching him. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message. They didn't need to speak to make their point clear. Alex had crossed a line, and now he was at the mercy of forces far beyond his understanding. The days dragged on, and Alex couldn't escape the feeling that he was being judged, not just for what he had done, but for what he might do next. The realization slowly crept in that there was nothing he could do to change his fate. His fate had already been sealed. He wasn't in control anymore. When Alex was finally discharged from the hospital, he thought it would be over. But what awaited him wasn't relief. It was the beginning of a nightmare. As he left the hospital, he was surrounded by 70 bikes, an escort that followed him wherever he went. Life after his release was a slow unraveling. Alex tried to resume his normal routine, but no matter where he went, he couldn't escape the ever-present eyes of the bikers. At the gas station, on street corners, in the shadows of alleyways, they were always there, watching, waiting. At first, Alex thought it was just paranoia, a product of the brutal beating he had endured. But as the days passed, the reality set in. They weren't just following him, they were making sure he couldn't escape. No matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, they were always one step behind. Alex tried to hide, but it was useless. The bikers were always just within his sight, 2 or 3 of them, silently watching, waiting like predators biding their time. Every step he took, every corner he turned, they were there, unmoving, their gaze unblinking, never leaving him. At first, Alex tried to summon the courage to take action. He considered going to the police, telling them everything. The affair, the threats, the bikers, the surveillance, and the constant fear that had become his life. He even had the story ready, a full confession of what had been happening. But every time he tried to make a move, something stopped him. It wasn't just fear. It was terror, a deep-rooted anxiety that gnawed at his gut, a sense that no matter what he did, it wouldn't matter. The bikers were everywhere, and there was nowhere safe. One day, as Alex was walking toward the local police station, he stopped dead in his tracks. Across the street, he saw a familiar figure, the town's police chief. But it wasn't just the sight of him that made Alex freeze. It was the leather biker jacket the chief was wearing, the very same jacket the bikers wore, the one with the unmistakable patch. His heart dropped, his body going cold with dread. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a local gang of criminals. This was their town. The bikers weren't some rogue group. They were embedded in the very fabric of the community. Their influence extended into every corner of town. And now Alex could see that it stretched into the police force itself. The chief, the very person he had once trusted to protect him, was in on it, part of the very system that had now ensnared him. Alex stood frozen, his eyes locked on the police chief, whose face gave nothing away. The chief walked past him without even glancing in his direction, but the message was clear. There was no escaping this. The town, his home, was under the control of people who answered to a darker, more dangerous force than Alex could have ever imagined. The realization sank in deep. The bikers weren't just following him, they were controlling him. Every move he made was being watched, not only by the bikers, but by the very institution he had once believed would protect him. The town he had known all his life had turned into a prison, and there was no way out. His every action, every step, was monitored. His mind began to spiral, the weight of the truth bearing down on him. It was no longer just about escaping the bikers, it was about surviving. Alex could no longer ignore the fact that he had no safe place left. There was no longer a place for him to hide, and even if he tried, they would find him. The bikers had their claws in everything, and they weren't going to let him slip away. With no other options, Alex knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay. He couldn't fight, not against Ben's world, and certainly not against the bikers who had infiltrated every part of the town, including the police force. He had no choice but to leave. That night, Alex packed the few things he had left. He didn't bother telling anyone. There was no point. The bikers had won. They had broken him, cornered him, and made sure there was nowhere for him to run. The last thing he could do was disappear. He had no other choice but to vanish, to leave this town behind before they made the decision for him. The next morning, Alex was gone. He left without a word to anyone, slipping away as silently as he had come. As he drove away, leaving behind everything he had once known, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The constant surveillance was gone. He wasn't being hounded anymore. The oppressive weight of the biker's gaze had lifted. But even as he drove away, Alex knew one thing for certain. Wherever he went, Whatever he did, the shadows would always be there. The bikers had marked him, and Bin's world, with its endless reach, would never let him forget. What do you think about Bin's decision to take matters into his own hands when he discovers Kathy's affair? Was his response justified, or did he go too far in his pursuit of revenge? How do you feel about the way Kathy manipulated the situation, and was she fully aware of the consequences of her actions? The biker world Bin is a part of plays a huge role in this story, but how much do you think Bin's past and connections influenced the outcome of the entire situation? Do you think Kathy underestimated the power Bin held? And how does this story explore the idea of control within relationships? After everything that happened, could Kathy and Alex ever truly escape the fallout? Or does betrayal and deceit always have lasting consequences?